We need to build societies that are not founded on the violent presuppositions of liberalism, but on the peace of Christ. To do this, we need to acquire a fresh, spiritual way of thinking, beyond the boring categories that modernity has to offer. Catholic social teaching is this fresh way of thinking. I'm Jacob Farid Imam. From Post-Liberal Thought, this is The Catholic Social Difference with Andrew Willard Jones. Andrew, we're starting off this podcast. You're sitting down in my library with a cup of coffee, and you started to say too many interesting things, so I'm starting us off a little bit faster than we usually do. You began talking about Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum. People often assume that this is a place where the church begins its discussion on social doctrine.
Yeah, 1891, right? And people will say the birth of Catholic social doctrine, the beginning of Catholic social thought, as if something radically new had happened. Like the church had finally realized that there was this thing called society and we had something to say about it, which is given
everything we've
talked about and the very content of Christianity is a bizarre thought, right? Like it doesn't, it's weird.
It is strange, but no, it would seem to me that the reason why people make this assumption is because the church finally had an alternative system to fight against.
Right.
I think ideologies is a really important place to start, right, because it was something new to the modern world that you don't see in the ancient world. I think that there are some real, true categorical differences between what you find in, say, socialism compared to what the god kings of the ancient world believed and were doing.
Right.
And maybe we can discuss why that is. And that's a good place why you think that is.
Ideologies are systems of thought that claim to exhaust the world. If we contrast them with what you were talking about with ancient or medieval thought, where there's always an understanding, or almost always an understanding, that the world that we encounter is not fully open to our control. Right? The world that we encounter always has layers of symbolism or layers of meaning that we're discovering, that we're grasping after.
Right.
And we develop systems of thought of wisdom, really, that help us navigate that world or try to make sense of it.
Right. So to make this, or to concretize this in certain ways, you look at the Greeks in their tetralogy of plays that they would put on every year, or at least the Athenians in this case, where you end up with these grand paradoxes and absolute mysteries, right, and extreme barriers that human reason and human capability cannot surpass,
right,
when faced with the gods.
It's that sort of idea that the height of wisdom is humility.
Right, which is also quite strange because it wasn't really a virtue in the ancient world before Christ. And yet, even still, they knew when it came to having a holistic, rational mindset, that was the one place where humility was needed, or something attuned,
something like that,
to humility.
Yeah, and in Christianity, it becomes just outright humility.
Right, exactly.
Before the mystery of the world. This idea that the things of the world are creations of God, thoughts of God. Their essences are thoughts of God, not our thoughts.
So turn back to your definition of ideology. Would you put it as a rational, a closed rational system in which you could interpret and understand everything of the world? There's a way of interpreting everything that you experience in the world.
Right. So what happens with ideology is that you've created a linguistic, rational, philosophical account of the world that is exhaustive. There's nothing in creation in the world, in reality, that isn't capable of being categorized and placed in its place within the ideological system. And then you suppose the ideological system being prior to reality. All right, so the problem isn't then I'm engaging with reality and attempting to make sense of it. It's that I've made sense of reality. Now I need to fit the things I encounter into that sense. Right? It's a reversal of pre-modern thought. And the thing that's going on, of course, I think, is that ideology assumes that we're God. All right, so it assumes that there's nothing that is above our reason, our linguistic and rational ability to make sense of things. So in order for that to hold water, you have to basically deny the existence of things outside of the mind. The ideas are prior to the things. It's a form of nominalism.
Heraclitus is considered to be a father of nominalism. He was a pre-Socratic philosopher who said that, if you stand in a river and you look at it, you watch it flow, is it still the same river in every moment?
Right.
Its identity seems to be changing the whole time. And so the essence of that river seems to be something that's only in one's mind.
It's just a name.
It's just a name.
Yeah.
And of course, this was an idea that carried some weight and was popular for a while. Of course, Plato and Aristotle created systems that didn't allow for this. Mm-hmm. The essence of a thing for Plato corresponded to its form. Aristotle, the essence somehow resided in the thing itself. But the first time that you have nominalism as a full-blown system is actually in the Muslim world, where sure, the idea that was captured in the mind of Allah, but he could change anything at his own whim. And this is not something that would be philosophically inconsistent for a Muslim, but rather a point of pride, because it bespeaks the power of God.
So the heart of it is that there's nothing fundamentally but particulars, right? There's nothing fundamentally but this thing and that thing and the other thing over there.
Yeah, you can call this and that a table. They're both tables, but they're very much different essences and different identities. We just give them the name tables.
But in the world, in the Islamic system that then carries over into the Christian systems of the 14th century and beyond, is that God, extrinsically from without, imposes order upon that world of particular things through law.
Exactly.
Extrinsic law.
Exactly, yeah.
And this can create the illusion of essences, right? Mm-hmm. Because things are being categorized, but in groups, sort of, according to the way the law behaves.
Right, exactly.
Because they respond to that extrinsic law in the same way, which makes them the same kind of thing, but not in their essence, but always externally, within the will of the lawgiver.
Exactly.
Right.
And that could change.
The things are only what they are because he decrees it to be so.
Exactly. Of course, this corresponds to something at a human level, too, where the human lawgiver could decree something to be what it is, and in the very next moment say, I think about it differently now.
Well, this is explicitly what happens in the formation of the concept of sovereignty in European political thought.
Right.
In the late Middle Ages and moving into the early modern period, is the idea that the king is God. Like quite directly, like he sits on the throne of God. He is to the men of his kingdom. He is as God,
right?
And
which is different than when Paul in Romans talks about divine election of kings.
Well, the huge distinction between what we were talking about last time about the mediation of God through a man, men, which is the kingship, priesthood, prophetic notions, classic notions in Christianity, to you're the source of order. The sovereign king is that absolutist God, the nominalist God on earth, basically, who provides order to his society through his will. And his will is law.
So when we read that, in Deuteronomy 17, when God said that you will ask for a man to rule you and I will give you one, but at the end of this long dictum of decrees of things that the man won't do, the ruler won't do. He won't have taxes. He won't have a standing army. He won't take many wives. Right. But also, it's most important that he will read the law.
Yeah, that's right. He's a minister of the law, not the creator of it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, because there's a God. This is that open-endedness of Judaic and then Christian political theory. There is no sovereign among men, and that's why the kings are always capable of being judged. Right? They're capable of error. But that's precisely what goes away in modernity. The king is not capable of being judged any longer. He is the source of right and wrong. He is the source of morality. And the Christian thinkers who advance this theory, so it's absolutism, we might think of it, to the extent they're nominalist Christians, so that they still believe that the king will be held to account, but he'll be held to account directly by God. And there's no one on earth and no one underneath his rule who's capable of judging him, because there's no one capable of a standard by which to judge. He creates the standards. The king does, right? So the king becomes an absolute barrier between the divine and people. Even if you retain the idea of a god, the king, for all intents and purposes, to the people, is God.
So say that you're a, very earnest Christian in this system. You have this understanding of reality, of a mysterious sacramental liturgical order, but then you have something more particular, that you have just these duties, these laws that you have to follow because the king just tells you to.
Right.
So maybe by mindset, you could be a Christian, but by external action in your common day life, you have to be a nominalist according to the sovereign's dictums.
Yeah, the world of action becomes the world as ordered by the sovereign. Like I need to see in the world what the sovereign sees in order to move within it.
Right.
Right. I can't suppose it to be something other than what the law is decreeing it to be.
In your article, The End of Sovereignty,
right,
you give this example of when you had to take your kids on a field trip or something like that. Even though you were driving in your car with your own children, taking them to a museum or something. Yeah. You had to sign a waiver that you, as person A, were responsible for children B, C, D in car X.
Yeah, I had to give evidence of health insurance, evidence of car insurance, evidence, all this kind of stuff. Right?
And you were just driving your kids.
My own kids to the museum. I could have done it at any time. It's just because I happened to be doing it with a certain club. And they, of course, I mean, this gets into a whole nother ball of wax, opens a whole nother can of worms here. But that because they are a legal entity, right, that is defined by the extrinsic law, their relations have to be also governed in that way. So my relationship with the club has to be extrinsic, has to be defined legally, right? And so our relationship, even though our actual relationship is a group of men who know each other by name, right? In reality, the fiction is that we are citizen A, citizen B, citizen D in a particular legally sanctioned relationships.
Yeah.
Right.
And so even though so
there's this false reality or fictitious reality is sort of laid on top of reality.
Representation replaces reality.
Right. And so what ideologies do is mistake or assert that representation is more real. This is just to jump way off, like George Orwell's sort of doublethink type situation, right? Like when you see the world around you, and then you don't see it for what it is, you see it for its extrinsic registration within the legal system, right?
Yeah. So in the 19th century, I guess the century before, certainly, you have the developments of particular ideologies for the first time. And just to go back and summarize, because we've already within these 18 minutes, we've talked about a lot of complicated things. Yeah. The ancient world was a world more or less that saw reality as inherent to a particular order, but also a mysterious order, one that you could begin to articulate but never fully understand.
You can't master it. Right?
You can't ever comprehend it. You can never perfectly articulate it, and therefore you can't perfectly control it. As soon as you can articulate something, especially we see this in law, as soon as you can articulate something in law, then you can control it. The same thing works with some mental gymnastics, just in a person's mind. Oh, that happens. I know how to interpret it. You know, A happens. That's B or whatever. Right. What we find really in the Muslim world is championing this idea of nominalism. Is first, there's not these mysterious essences that reside in the physical world, the natural world.
It's just a big pile of stuff.
It's a big pile of stuff that God Himself created, but also named and can change the identity of. At His whim. And I'll go off and toss this in too, that there were quite a number of prominent Muslim thinkers whose works were translated from Arabic to Latin and were standard in the curricula of the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and Paris through the Middle Ages. And you start to see some of their thinking show up. Whether or not it's correlation, causation, doesn't really matter, but it's certainly true that in the 14th century and going forward, this nominalist mindset appears in the West.
God is not a loving father sitting around the dinner table trying to move us into our perfection, but is
arbitrary
tyrant lawgiver who your proper reaction to is submission.
Yeah, and actually, that's not even a slight to say that for a Muslim.
No, right. I don't think
Al-Ghazali, who is like the Augustine of the Muslim world, used that exact phrase, an arbitrary tyrant.
Yeah, I don't think we're slandering them by saying that.
No, not at all. But what is important for us is that once this nominalist mindset came into the West with a completely different theological understanding infusing it, you have a rampant individualism that emerges, where the singular citizen can then look around at the world and decree it for what it is, or for what he thinks it is. Excuse me.
Right.
And this allows,
and his relationship with others is extrinsic, because the relationship of all things is extrinsic. It's decreed from without.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
So it's not that I'm born into a family. It's that I come into the world as an individual thing, just like everything else. And I am then situated within a family extrinsically, right? Like the roles that we all play are roles that are assigned to us by an external will.
Right. And you started to mention that with things that are not natural to the creative order. So like a table, for instance, something that man creates.
Right.
You do have the power to define what a table is.
Yeah, we made it.
Exactly. Yeah. But there are things that,
I mean, in so much as it is as a table, we can't exhaust what it's made out of. An understanding of that.
Yep.
Or, it really is, insofar as it is the thing that we create. It is that thing, which means it's ours.
Yeah, we can control it, we name it, we have this identity,
Yep.
whether it's a car, a couch, a table, doesn't matter.
Right.
But as soon as we try and have that same disposition towards the created order, that God, what God himself created alone, then everything begins this change. We come to this understanding that we're not trying to understand the mystery of God through his creation and participate in his created order in order to have a more intimate relationship with him. But instead we begin to think that we can manipulate and become masters of nature.
The world, this is if you're going to dare to sort of reduce the Enlightenment to one idea, which is probably a bad idea. But let's just say something like the world around us is made up of nothing other than that which is below us, in a sense, right? In a sort of social hierarchy, or the celestial sort of cosmic hierarchy, right? So the world, everything that's around us, everything that we encounter is fully intelligible to us, and capable of being contained within our rationality, within our own, with no appeal to anything higher. So this is the idea of like unaided reason, right? Like we can see the world for what it is. We can understand the way it works, and theoretically without remainder, right? Like without gaps.
Right.
Like, so gaps are a problem of, we just haven't gotten there yet. We haven't exhausted our research yet. Right, we have to think things through. We have to learn more about the world, but we're just filling in the gaps until it's a complete picture, right? And that's within our power to do theoretically. That notion, that Enlightenment idea, when translated into politics and social thought, becomes ideology. There's nothing. We've got to come up with the rational system that makes sense of everything socially, that exhausts it, that then allows us to manipulate it. Right, because that's what we're doing with the material world. That's what the scientific revolution is about, right? Is learning about nature to the point that we can then manipulate it with our own structures. Socially, then, the idea is we're going to determine the laws of human society. We're going to find what they are. And this isn't learning the essences of things. This is learning the extrinsic laws, like the laws of physics, that seem to govern it. And then we're going to be able to use those laws to build a better machine.
There's 3 ideologies that I'd love to talk about: liberalism, socialism, and nationalism.
Okay. The motto or the slogan of the French Revolution is of course, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Mm-hmm. And that is the slogan in the revolution that sweeps away the remnants of the old regime that at this point is modern. It's not medieval or anything. I mean, that's a mistaken notion, but it still had a lot of the medieval forms and things like that. So sweeping it away. And then what happens in the 19th century is that without Christianity holding those 3 things together, all 3 of which are Christian ideas.
Sure.
Right? Yeah. Liberty, equality, fraternity. They break apart from each other. They can't hold together. And so the ideals that underwrite the revolution and all the revolutions that come from the French Revolution, liberty, I think, becomes turned into the ideology of liberalism. That sort of idea within the French Revolution, equality to socialism, ideologically to socialism, and then fraternity to nationalism. Well, I mean, how do you hold liberty, equality, and fraternity together?
No, exactly.
Right,
so they had to break them apart.
You hold it together within Christianity, because Christianity provides a context which the paradoxes or the contradictions between those 3 are resolved, right? And they actually come into a harmony. So once you get rid of that synthesizing effect, they become contradictory, right? Liberty and fraternity, like individual freedom to do whatever you want, and love of neighbor, right? Like love constricts you.
Yeah.
Right? They don't hold together.
Yeah.
Right? But let's start with liberalism, because it's the easiest for us to understand. And I think really it's the first, it's sort of the king of the ideologies. Within liberalism, what is man? Is the question. And, we're going to be very simplistic here to make it simple. But basically the idea is men are individual actors, rational actors, who are utility maximizing rational actors. So they are independent of each other intrinsically. They're just a mind and a person, right? Who is attempting to maximize his own subjective utility. So whatever it may be that he thinks is good for him to have. Whatever it is. So it'll develop into utilitarianism, the idea of the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. But even that doesn't really tell us anything, because pleasure is whatever happens to give any particular individual pleasure.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And that can vary from person to person.
A masochist could have a
there's no standard to
guy.
Judge between them. Yeah. Right. Because the fundamental anthropology is a subjective rational actor. Rational meaning he pursues his ends of pleasure, of utility. So usefulness, always by picking whatever course of action he judges to be best at doing it, best at fulfilling it. Right. So it's a tautology. It's a definition. Right. So once you've defined man as a utility maximizing rational actor, there's no counterexample that can be given that can't be made to fit. This is an axiom like geometry.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
So it doesn't matter what you do, and people do this. It's like sometimes you'll go, well, what about Mother Teresa? And their answer is, well, she thought that it was more in her interest to give her life over to caring for the poor than to not do it. And it's like, okay.
Yeah, how many times have you heard that?
It's just tedious.
More in her interest.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes, it's like, yeah, all you're doing is sticking to a definition.
So
right?
Really what they're able to do is put Mother Teresa and the most flamboyant frat boy into the same category as pleasure seekers.
Right. Yeah. One just has a more maybe a more sophisticated form of pleasure, or maybe just, but even that would be adding judgment to it. It's just different.
Yep.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. So society then doesn't really exist. So what society is,
because you can't describe it. It's just individuals that you can.
It's just the summation of individuals who are utility maximizers. Mm-hmm. So they're interacting with each other, trying to maximize their utility through their interactions, making deals basically.
But you don't have a total order moving as a whole, or that can be described.
Well,
as
you
a
can't.
Whole.
So if you introduce some sort of prior situation, so if you introduce, say, that the world that the individual comes into is a social world, sort of a socially constructed world to a certain extent. So his choices are already constrained by society itself, by the constitution of the social order that he comes into, of the mores and culture that he comes into. You've now introduced a variable that liberalism can't deal with. Because then you have to say, well, is that order good or is it bad? Is it providing him with good choices or bad choices? Is it, but right? You don't want that. So what
that is what we find in our world.
Well,
and
it's
what people
obviously
are
true, right? But
yeah.
what you need to have instead is that society comes into being as a derivative thing that's derivative from individual human interactions. So this is where you get all the kind of just sort of obviously silly creation myths that the liberals give us about like the state of nature and then the social contract and all of that. Mm-hmm. Right? So how does it that society comes together? Well, in the beginning, it's a bunch of individuals, right? And these individuals are all living independent of each other. And it doesn't matter, they have variations on the theme, but the theme is that they're all trying to seek their self-interest, and that often leads them to violence because I want what you have. And if I'm pursuing my self-interest, that means I'll knock you on the head and take it. They realize that that's not a nice situation to be in. That doesn't maximize their self-interest. That's actually, so what will maximize their self-interest is if they bound together and make certain rules for the game, certain rules of interaction. And they all kind of agree on these rules, and that's the birth of society, right? So the birth of society is an extrinsic, rule-based thing that governs individuals in their pursuit of individual pleasure, right?
Great succinct way of putting it.
That's the way society is born, and that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we're talking about Locke or Hobbes or whatever. I mean, that's basically what they're doing, and then all the way up to the moderns. I mean, the Austrian economists have the same creation myth,
right? Yep.
Okay, so individuals then. What liberalism would advance is that okay, so that's the anthropology, that's our situation. So then, how do we build the best machine then based upon that? And the best machine is a social machine would be on those laws is one in which human interaction is we try to reduce as much as possible the situations where two human beings might be tempted to hit each other on the head to take stuff. Right? Because they're just self-interested, rational actors. So that means what we want to do is extend that extrinsic juridical organization to encompass more and more of human interaction. I mean, the consequence really is, to summarize it very simply, is that we want all of human interaction to be contractual. Mm-hmm. So you and I are not fighting each other because we've made an agreement. I will give you something that I own that you value in exchange for something that you own that I value. And so the idea with liberalism is that this is a very good thing because and the system, the logic here is very simple and very compelling, right? So you give the simple example of a commercial exchange. I have $1 and you have a loaf of bread. I want the loaf of bread more than I want my $1. You want the $1 more than you want your loaf of bread. So I give you the $1, you give me the loaf of bread. We walk away and we're both richer, right? We both have something that we value more than what we had before.
Right.
Since wealth is nothing but subjective value, we're both richer, which means society as a whole is richer.
Yeah.
Right?
Net gain.
There's a net gain for society as a whole. Society is wealthier because we made the trade. Now, you just absolutize that. So what you want to say is, therefore, if we can make every human interaction an exchange, then every human interaction increases the net wealth of society. And this is what Ludwig von Mises and stuff are arguing. The Austrian economists,
right. Mm-hmm.
that all human interaction is either war or exchange, right? Or deal making. And he would go so far as to say all human action is deal making. So like when I decide to walk out of this room, I'm exchanging one situation for what I perceive to be a better one, right? Every human interaction is exchange of some sort. All right, so that's the basic conception of exchange as being what you want to maximize the total utility of society as a whole. So as many contractual relationships as possible. And the only choice is contractual or hegemonic, right? So you're either in a contractual relationship or one is dominating the other, right? They don't have any category for something in between.
Something in between, or even a completely different
different. Right.
So instead of contractual, I'll leave this room for a better state outside this room.
Right.
There's a duty compelling me that, well, magnify my soul outside this room.
Yeah. So they would
put it in a very grandiose way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So they because it's a tautology, they can always account for those things. You're just adding layers to the utility pursuit.
Yeah, but there's a way of interpreting every single human interaction.
Every human interaction can be fit within the system, and then the question that then just has to be asked is what are our goals here? And if our goal is maximizing subjective utility realization, then the best way to do that is to totalize contractual relations.
You're listening to The Catholic Social Difference. You can get our podcasts, our videos, and our print magazine for one annual membership cost, available on our website, postliberalthought.com. Many have made the argument that liberalism emerged from Protestantism. So God declares the sinner to be righteous.
That's right.
He doesn't lead him into righteousness. He doesn't slowly groom him into being a perfect image of God, of Jesus Christ. He rather just gives that sinner Jesus Christ's scorecard.
You think about the pessimism of liberalism and as far as human nature is concerned, right? That the assumption is that human beings are fundamentally selfish and nothing else. Altruism is a nonsense word. That seems to map pretty easily onto the notion of total depravity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And that what Christianity offers is not healing from that condition. It's actually, in spite of the persistence of that condition, salvation.
Right.
So salvation happens after this world, in spite of our incessant, non-altering fallenness.
Right. So we see that legal arrangement between man and God, but that also corresponds to man and man.
Right.
So if you're going to love God and love neighbor, it's going to be through two contracts.
Right, exactly.
And you hope that it comes down to your heart as something genuine, but it's really not going to. And that's why you need contracts.
Right.
So within this liberal paradigm, then you have these individual actors who are trying to work against the natural law, really and truly, because the natural law does not speak to an individual human being on his own, maximizing his gain or his pleasure, but rather living in this proper social order so that he might be able to adore God aright.
That's right. So the end of society is of course, like you said, the adoration of God, or the movement of men into the vision of God.
Yeah.
But that happens socially. When we talk about the common good of a family, it presupposes the family as the thing, right? And the individuals within the family.
Right.
Right, as members of the family, and there's goods that they pursue as a family. You can't have that in liberalism.
Well, no,
what they end up with is just the accumulative good of society, or the summation of good becomes the common good.
Right. It is very strange when you read the early liberals, even now today, is that it is always an individual on his own in the forest where you begin, or in the fields where you begin. It's like, where's his mom and his dad?
Well, yeah, liberalism is the ideology of childless men who have forgotten their own childhood, right? Like there's no dependency, right? I was talking about this with my wife last night, because we were talking about how in our society, our ideological vision, which is basically liberal, late liberal, and really the world that we've kind of attempted to build around it, assumes no dependence. So it assumes an individual actor who's basically caring only for himself. And so children have no place, right? Children are always this weird anomaly, which is the reason why liberalism is forced to either create this paradoxical realm of the private where things like family can function, that for some bizarre reason don't obey the same laws, right? And it's just sort of like, let's not delve too deeply into that. Let's just let there be this realm where apparently I can have domination over children or something, which isn't a violation of their human rights or something, right? Even though liberalism liberalism doesn't have within itself doesn't have the categories to deal with that, right? So it's just either ignored, or it's the idea is to extend liberalism into the family and basically destroy the family, right? To destroy, to make it a contractual arrangement.
So, which is why
at the most radical, you get people like Murray Rothbard, these libertarians, who in order to make the system work, have to say that children are owned, they're property, they're owned by their parents. Because how else do you account for the relationship, right? You have to say, well, they're not. They are. It's a totally logical and rational solution to the problem of children. And so he would say that you can starve them to death or sell them or whatever, you own them.
That's horrifying.
But how else do you justify the parents' claim to them? Right? Aren't they just rational decision makers on their own? And just the fact that they happen to be less developed, it's like, well, if we introduce that as a problem, it's like, well, there's a whole bunch of inequalities in society. Some people are smarter than others. Some people are stronger than others. Some people have different cultural benefits than others. It's like, isn't that just degrees on? Isn't the parent-child relationship just a sort of outlier of the same problem of inequality within society? And if we've introduced, then, well, therefore, there's some sort of intrinsic relationship between those who have more power and those who are weaker, like a parent with their children. Well, then why wouldn't that be the case with someone who's smarter and someone who's less intelligent out in the world? And that then when you and I come to make a deal and I'm smarter than you, well, then it would be a violation of that, of some sort of pre-liberal principle for me to take advantage of you, right? But you can't admit that. You and I have to be equal out in the marketplace, out in the world. We have to be the same peers, right?
Now, a libertarian, we've talked to, brought up the Austrians affair, but to go, as far deep as you can within libertarianism,
right?
Which says, I don't want to have the state rule me or control me. I just give me the free market, and that will do its job. I think that is still a place that we haven't quite touched on. How would you understand libertarianism within the liberal social order when it pertains to politics?
I think the libertarians aren't actually advancing a political philosophy. It's merely a policy recommendation, right? So they basically believe in an absolutist sovereignty. So that they view the world as a bunch of individual actors who are moving within a regime that accounts for everything as property, and that everything is legally defined and it has legally defined relationships with each other. Mm-hmm. And what they want is that universal power that affords universal rights and property regulation to adopt a particular policy, which is to allow the individuals who are moving within it to pursue certain types of activities and not others, right? Whereas other people view the same absolute power, sovereign power, interacting with individuals, and think different policies in order. But it's not a philosophical argument. You see what they agree on what's happening when there are individual actors and there's the state.
They just want to limit this state.
They just say, well, what's the best relationship between those two things? And but the state isn't for them limited. The state is just as universal. The state is everywhere. If our relationship, if every human relationship is contractual, which is what libertarians would like, right? That's the way they envision it.
Yeah, totally, absolutely.
What is a contract? It's a legal relationship,
right?
And so there's three parties to every contract. There's you and me, and there's the state. Like what makes it a contract is that the state enforces it. So the state, where every time we make a contract, we're bringing the state into our relationship. What's effectively happening is that our relationship is being legislated. So the reason why the state can then enforce the contract is that through the mechanism is that through our agreement, we've in a sense created a little law, right? That is now coercive. bearing the state's coercion.
Right.
So when you say all human interaction is contractual, what you are saying is that all human interaction is political.
Or if you take it to a real libertarian extreme, if you don't obey this contract that we've made, then I have the right to punish you. Not even just a third party.
Yeah, but you have a right.
Exactly.
I mean, it's juridical.
It's still juridical.
So you are absolutizing the legal order. I mean, Murray Rothbard is absolutizing the legal order. There is no exception to the political regime for him when he talks about owning your children.
Yeah.
So they're not about limiting the power of the state at all. They're about totalizing it.
Yeah.
Right. And they don't see that because they're so enthralled to the axioms of liberalism that they don't understand that they're trapped within a system that is predicated upon the absolute power of the state. Like there's the axioms presuppose it. So you don't. Yeah, they're arguing with other liberals about policy, not philosophy.
And you can take advantage of others within this as long as they agree to the contracts. A major example of this is when we find that the subsistent farmers working within their guilds and sharing within their community have their land purchased by major capitalists and corporations so that they can no longer provide for themselves, and they're forced out of their land and into the factories.
Right.
That's the Industrial Revolution.
That's what happens, yeah.
Yeah.
The liberal sort of story is that the Industrial Revolution, okay, so you presuppose these self-interested and rational actors, and then you say, well, if the condition in the factories and the conditions in these new cities were so bad, why did everybody go there? It was all voluntary. People traveled there. People assumed they agreed to the salary they were getting paid. And so with our basic idea of exchange, that means they must have thought it was a better condition than what was preceding it. They were making rational decisions, so they must have been better off. Simple.
Yeah.
The problem is that it's not true. So so the problem is that the condition of the workers had already been conditioned by the rise of liberalism and capitalism. So what I mean is that those subsistence farmers, those peasants, basically, who lived in customary ways of life, what makes them eligible to move to the cities to become the proletariat is that way of life is destroyed in the countryside. And the way it's destroyed is by the commercialization of agriculture. And so what you have then, if you look at things like the enclosure movement starting in the 17th century and then accelerating, where these peasants are living in communities that are basically governed by customary farming practices, so that their relationship to the land is not one of private property, but one of shared use, basically, according to sort of customary regulations. So the commons, all this land that they share. So you might be a peasant who only sort of possesses a few acres for your own farming, but then you share in the use of thousands of acres, hundreds of acres, a forest, a stream, pasture land, right? The commons. And that's all regulated through sort of customary use. So what it is an economic system that doesn't suppose that all things are private property. There's this whole category of a private property in the sense of something that you own, that only you can use, and you can use in any way you want, is in the pre-modern world a category that's very, very limited, primarily limited to what they call mobile property, like stuff, like your shirt on your back, right? So real property or real estate, land, is never that way, almost never that way.
Right.
It always bears with it social obligations.
And so that's quite interesting, actually, because that goes back to the beginning of our conversation when we're talking about nominalism and realism, that the things that are properly made by God, the land, not the table, you know, the trees, not the couch.
Right,
exactly. These things have a certain relationship, or excuse me, that man has a certain relationship to these things that's different than the
He
things
can't.
that he's made.
I mean, I think in the classical sense, he can't properly possess them.
Right, they're not his.
They're not his. He can't come to entirely understand them. What he can do is make use of them. This goes all the way back to Eden. I mean, come on, when we were talking about having dominion and subduing, and what that means is ordering the created world towards the worship of God, but not owning it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm going to go on a John Locke rant here, but John Locke, in his foolishness, actually gives an account of the Garden of Eden, where he interprets having dominion as working the land, working the created order, so that you can come to own it, and basically build fences around it. Like he says, this enclosure is what Adam and Eve are doing.
Oh my!
Right. So they're creating private property. That's their. Oh my goodness! I just can't even believe you'd write that down. But he did, and the fact that people buy it is even crazier. Okay. So yeah. So there's a. This is very confusing to modern liberals, right? Because modern liberals, part of the axioms of liberalism is that all things are property, private property. Mm-hmm. And if you stop for a moment to think about our own world, can you think of anything that's not a piece of property? Anything?
Well, yeah, it's hard if working within that system. Like there's nothing. This jacket.
I mean, as far as the state is concerned, as far as the sort of legal order is concerned, everything is owned. Everything.
Yeah. The
leaf in your yard is yours.
Well, but I pay property taxes for it.
Yeah, I mean, but you know, it's like I guess the one thing I can come up with sometimes is the air.
No, that's true, but not yet in China. That's
what I'm saying is I think that's probably mostly because no one has figured out a mechanism for owning it.
Yeah.
For containing it.
Yeah. Right. If you ruin the air, then you can start to buy good air and then distribute it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So but the air allows us to see what the meaning of a common good would be, like a common property, something that's owned by everyone. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Not owned. Well, owned by everyone. Really, not owned by anyone.
Right. Yeah.
Would be a
used
better way
by everyone.
Used by everyone. Owned by no one.
Yeah.
And then you have to develop certain customary rules about how to use it. So we can all use the air, but if I pollute the air, if I pollute it too much, I mean, every time I exhale, in a sense, I pollute the air. But we have to allow that. But we can't. Well, we don't want to allow, massive pollution of the air. So you start getting ways of regulating the common property that aren't about private property, right? Okay, so you got to extend that in your imagination to include most of the material of the world, right? And that's the pre-modern, the pre-capitalist, the pre-liberal conception of stuff, right? The stuff of the world is not owned by you or you, him or that, whatever. It is used by all of us. And that doesn't mean it's unregulated, and it doesn't mean that there aren't people with particular responsibility for it, right? So like the word that's most often used or most often translated as property when we're talking about the Middle Ages is dominion, to have dominion over something, and that's just not to own it.
Yeah,
right? I mean that goes back to Adam,
right?
To have dominion is to rule it in a sense, but
right.
For its ends and for the common good, for the ends of the other people who are dependent upon it. So the lord of an estate doesn't own the estate.
Right.
He manages it.
Absolutely.
And he manages it for the peasants who live on it, right? Like he can't kick them off. They have rights. They have customary, they can use the forest for their firewood, and he can't just decide they can't.
Yeah.
They can fish in the stream, and he doesn't own it, right? Even though it's his estate.
Right.
That's not what it means for it to be his estate.
So then what
that's exactly what changes.
Okay, that's
so as we move into the modern world, the whole idea of enclosure was in fact he does own it. So we've invented this idea of we've extended the notion of private property from the shoes on your feet to everything, theoretically. And now we're going to make that happen legally. So the way we do it is we go, well, look at this common land here, the commons. Who owns it? That doesn't make any sense. No one owns it. It's like someone has to own it. The theory won't allow for no one to own it, right?
Right.
So who owns it? The Lord owns it. So let's enclose it and make it more efficient, right? So now that peasant who only owned or possessed 2 acres of land but had hundreds of acres at his disposal now only has the 2 acres. right?
No, you mentioned efficiency, and this is a really important part for our conversation. But where does that the value of efficiency, fit into the rest of the liberal framework?
Well, it's actually this is where the liberal system is its most brilliant. Is that if you can totalize self-interested and rational behavior, this is sort of Adam Smith's insight. So every encounter is like you and I with the loaf of bread and the dollar.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
What you're doing is making it so that everybody is attempting to maximize their gain. So the outcome of that is a highly efficient allocation of resources, right? So if I have a dollar, it's a limited resource. It's a scarce resource. And there's a whole series of things that I can buy with that dollar. I'm going to pick the one that maximizes my gain, right? That I value more than the dollar the most. That's the best deal for me.
Right.
Right. And everybody's doing that.
Well, that's exactly what I do when I walk into a coffee shop and I say which pastry I want or which coffee I want. It's like, which one is going to make me happiest?
Yeah. So what I'm doing though, because everybody's doing that, it becomes the resources. So what sells the best becomes the best thing to have and to produce so that you can sell it. So what people want the most,
right,
is if you have the thing that people want the most, that's going to maximize your profit in the exchanges. You're going to be able to demand the most for it. So everybody's thinking that way. Everybody's basically engaged in the production of some goods and the trading of those goods. So if everybody does that, the effect is the most efficient allocation of resources and most efficient production of goods, right? So there's no denying the truth. Any opposition to liberalism can't be predicated on denying the truth of that. That's so. This is the problem that lots of socialists make, is that they want to argue that socialism will actually be more productive and produce more wealth than liberalism, which is an absurdity. Yeah. Right. So it's obviously the case that this produces, really does produce sort of maximal efficient allocation of resources. When it comes to agriculture, this is really important because agriculture is based on land and weather, basically, right? And so the comparative advantage, or what's the most efficient crop for me to grow in one chunk of land, is different than a different chunk of land, right? It might be some place where wheat is what this land is the very best at growing wheat. And so I should grow wheat, nothing else, because I can trade for the barley, right? I can grow more wheat here than anything else, which means I can trade for the beef. And some guy somewhere else where beef is his land and his weather conditions or whatever is most efficient for beef production. Yep. We'll do that and we'll trade and everyone will be richer.
So division of labor.
The division of labor, obviously, right? And that happens in agriculture. And so the movement of enclosure of the commons is directly connected to that movement. The efficient allocation of agricultural resources.
So when this supply and demand is perfectly met within the division of labor, when I have the beef that you want, you have the wheat that I want, then everything goes well. But who actually ends up consuming the beef and who ends up consuming
the people?
Just the people.
Yeah, ultimately, right?
I guess that's does division of labor necessarily correspond with the proper a just distribution?
Well, no, absolutely not. So I mean, I guess the way I would want to go about this is that this, what we're talking about in agriculture is the commercialization of agriculture, right? Because those exchanges, what you're doing is turning agriculture into commodities. Right. So you're turning the production of the produce of agriculture into commodities that can then be traded monetarily.
But that's the thing. It's for the best price. Right. Okay.
So what? But
it's not like I'm bartering this for my beef for your wheat.
Before I there's a place I want to go with that. But first, what I want to do is say what happens to the peasants when the agriculture is commercialized.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Because when it's commercialized and when the land becomes no longer commons but becomes private property, that means the peasants become no longer customarily related to the land, but become basically employees. Right? They become wage earners. And as you become more efficient, you need less of those people. Right. So think about how different this is. You're not in the pre-modern world. You are born into a village, and there's a people who lives in this estate, and they live on the estate, and the resources of the estate are what support them. Right. And they have the fishing rights and the wood rights and whatever and all this kind of stuff. The elimination of that, so that it's all the resources are now property that are being allocated efficiently for production, which means the people now, what do they have to sell? It's just their labor, right? So they're selling their labor as farmers within the system to the now owners of the property, and they become just another commodity. Their labor becomes another commodity, just like the way the wheat is a commodity or the beef is a commodity or whatever. And they have no claim to the produce of this, right? They're just selling their labor.
So you can literally sell time.
Yeah. But I mean, this is very productive. So a lot of the pro-liberals will go, yeah, don't you understand the massive production of food that occurred because of this, right? And it's like, yeah, that's absolutely right. There's a massive increase in the production of food, agricultural products, which fed the cities. Because what do all these peasants do now, right? We get the emergence of this whole new class, which is the rural poor, which doesn't exist before in a sense.
Yeah.
In a sense, sort of everybody's poor, kind of, in a subsistence environment, but they're all cared
Fed.
for.
Yeah.
And so now we get the emergence of a rural poor, which are trying to make ends meet through wage labor in agriculture, commercialized agriculture. Just massive poor rolls. Like the British government develops a whole system of parish relief to try to deal with all these poor people, right, who are now can't find work. And this is where we get the populations for urbanization, for the creation of industrialization in the cities, and the increased food production is what then feeds the cities.
Wow, that is a vicious circle there.
So, but the point is that guy who goes to the city to get a factory job, it's like, yeah, it's better than starving in the countryside.
My goodness, yeah.
But it's not necessarily better than the customary peasant life that they had 100 years ago.
Right, they're probably eating just as well, if not worse.
Oh, they were eating better as peasants.
Yeah, I was reading some old documents, and people were mentioning that during the reign of subsistence farming, which they still had in memory, the line was everyone ate meat.
Yeah, yeah.
Everyone ate meat. Yeah.
No, I mean, okay, but you asked about the justice of the allocation of the resources. I mean, I think the classic example is the Irish potato famine. Where
so usually the way that I hear this story, or like it was taught it growing up, was that the subsistence farmers faced yet another famine, except this time they had a way out, going to America.
Right.
And so it was.
So do you know that maybe it's less often told, but you have this famine going on, millions are dying, ultimately. Ireland was still exporting agricultural products to England to sell as the peasants were starving to death. Right? The peasants couldn't pay as much as the markets in London could pay for the products. So the efficient allocation, the profit maximizing allocation, is to sell that product to England.
Okay, so let me just make sure I get this. So the people who used to work on the farms or work the land, make their potatoes as well as herd their cattle and eat their livestock.
Right.
No longer owned any of this. The people that did,
right,
took the labor of those same people and the things that they were producing, the crops that they were producing and the livestock that they were caring for. And instead of feeding them who actually worked the ground,
they sold it.
They sold it when all of these people were dying because the only thing they could afford was potatoes.
Yeah, because they had nothing to gain. They had nothing to sell but their labor, and their labor wasn't worth very much.
That's diabolical.
It is diabolical. Herbert Spencer,
yeah,
famous liberal theorist, often championed by libertarians and stuff in his theory. he would talk about letting the orphan die in the gutter as being an act of the sort of toughness that allows that is for humanity's best interest. That it's a sort of hygiene of humanity, because the weak have nothing to sell. They're not contributing to the efficiency and the best thing. I mean, like,
So it's Darwinian.
it becomes Darwinian. Yeah,
Yeah.
of course it becomes Darwinian.
Yeah, no wonder he arises at this time.
Yeah, it's all these are all interrelated movements.
Yeah.
But you see the extension of a certain notion of private property socially is a sort of key idea. Right?
So if you have your private property and you're raising whatever you can on it, you want to sell it for whatever you can get most for it,
Yeah.
which is a complete inversion of not only what Christ's commendation is in the Gospels of caring for your neighbor. It's not only a complete inversion of the spiritual genius of the church, which commends the poor. Well, this is kind of an active fight against it for yourself, and in the process, you make your neighbors even poorer.
Yeah, and it's it destroys the very notion of justice, right? So the very notion of justice, the liberals, because of the absolutizing of property and individual rights, eliminate the concept of justice. So for them, justice merely means not committing fraud.
Because that's the one principle that they uphold is law and contracts.
So if you
break that,
if you break your contract, that's unjust. It's just evacuating all meaning from the word justice. They no longer have a concept of justice.
Wow. So this is what socialism is reacting against.
Yeah.
You know? So
we haven't even talked about the urbanization, like what actually is happening in the factories. These workers are coming from the countryside into the cities to produce, to turn the raw materials of the world that are produced by now commercialized agriculture or mining into products that are then being sold again on the marketplace, right? So the human labor is just one input in the factory among all the other. In fact, the very logic of the factory is that it's a perfectly efficient machine, right? That's the idea. And so human beings are just literally a component of the factory machine, right? And they talk about them that way. The theorists of the factory talk about the people that way.
Wow.
One of the objectives for the efficiency of a factory is reducing the human aspect of the human workers, basically. So you want to reduce any realm for creativity or skill.
Oh my God.
And one of the reasons is because creative and skillful people become willful, because they have dignity in their work and they perceive themselves as having some stake in it. And so you want to reduce that as much as possible. And so that they're merely technicians of the machines,
oh my
right?
Gosh.
Which is obviously the most efficient. He's obviously right.
Yeah, of course it is.
And he says,
this is the assembly line.
Then they go so far as to say it's particularly useful to have women and children because they lack the kind of willful assertion that the men have, right? So get those kids out there because they'll just do what you say for nothing. It actually makes me very emotional when I think about this because I've read a lot of these accounts and, I have little children and what they did to these kids, sending 7-year-olds into the mines where there's these accounts where they never see daylight because they work 6 days a week from before the sun comes up to after the sun goes down in underground. And then they have Sunday off and they're so exhausted, their poor little 7-year-old selves, that they just sleep all day. And then off to the mines Monday morning. Yeah, it's horrendous. But hey, it was the efficient allocation of resources, right? We're producing a lot. They'll work for it. They must need it. I mean, can you imagine that actually... I can't imagine, whatever. I mean, imagining that works for you is that justification is psychotic. But they actively argued that. Like the people who are arguing against child labor laws, there are people arguing against them in public, making the arguments for the efficient system of wealth production. Yeah.
So there's no wonder that communism, socialism rose up against
Absolutely
this.
no wonder. In fact, the popes totally acknowledge this. Like they say the reason why socialism is happening is because of the gross injustices of the liberal system.
Right, in rerum novarum. No,
Yeah.
if we'll get into socialism in the next podcast,
Okay.
and in the third ideology, nationalism, and the one following.
Right.
But just kind of quickly, there's, Austrian economics has made a rise in the last few decades, and certainly libertarianism is going strong.
Right.
Isn't what they want just a return to this old system without such great state interference? Or I shouldn't put it like that. Government and interference in government programs, having the free market and individual actors rather than the bureaucracy itself.
Yeah, I mean,
stepping in.
There's serious theoretical problems. So for example, if everybody is self-interested and rational actors trying to maximize their utility, and why in the world wouldn't they use the government against each other?
Mm-hmm. That's what they're
Like,
doing.
like on what grounds would they not attempt to deploy the state against each other, or attempt to use the state for their own benefit? Like, I want healthcare. I want more money. The most efficient way for me to use my resources is to get a politician to use the power of the state to give me healthcare. How is that not libertarian?
Right. Well, that makes sense why a guy like Peter Thiel.
No, I mean,
it's like
it rests in order. You have to argue. So this is the problem with Ludwig von Mises. Is one of the problems with this whole theory of human action, because it's like, if you're actually expounding a theory of human action, what you have to be doing is describing the world in which we actually live, right? Because this is the product of human action. What I would argue is that the libertarian fantasy world is actually the closest we ever get to achieving that is late 19th century England, which I think they actually acknowledge. It's like the period of classical liberalism, right? Which is exactly the time when you have a ideological liberalism who's ruling, and they're ruling over a population of workers who are not really liberal, who are basically still peasants in their mindsets. It's exactly the democratization of liberalism that gets us the welfare state. And what we have, everybody's after their own gain. Why? Well, you'd have to assume that people have some sort of a ideological belief in the sanctity of someone else's property.
Yeah.
But the whole origin story tells us that's not the case. The whole creation story, they have to say something like, it's wrong for me to vote the state to take someone else's property because that's their private property and private property is sacred. Okay, but why would you believe that? Where does that come from? That's a dogma, right? And then the very origin stories of liberalism say that that's not the case, right? That we start out at war with each other, taking each other's property at will, and that we create the state because we think it's in our best interest to do that. Well, I think it's in my best interest for the state to take your property and give it to me. Why wouldn't I do that? Like they have to introduce an external ideological principle in order to maintain their fantasy, right? What they really need is an ideologically pure party to rule, right? That rules and creates this environment and manages. This is the laissez-faire is planned idea, right? Plans laissez-faire economics and maintains it, and doesn't allow people to deviate. It forces them to work within a particular policy arrangement. I guess they could try. Why not try to do that? I guess, right? If they think that's what ought to happen.
Yeah.
But you see how they're imposing a value system.
Yeah, absolutely. And the peasants finally rise up against it. Yeah. And that's what much of the chaos of the last century, witnessed was
right. And that's what the papacy acknowledges.
And that's what the papacy acknowledges.
I mean, especially when we get into the 20th century about what's going on with communism and socialism. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's what we'll pick up next time with ideology number 2, the reaction against all of this.
Right.
And and then see its problems as well.
Yeah.
Thanks.
This has been The Catholic Social Difference with Andrew Willard Jones. To join in, write us a letter on our website or talk with us on Twitter. But most importantly, do pray for the conversion of your community to the truth of Catholic social doctrine.
All my life.